A cowboy prayed alone at the crossroads until a widow laid her son's hat beside his boots. The dust settled around Samuel's weathered boots as he knelt at the crossroads. Desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by the weathered wooden sign creaking in the wind. His calloused hands pressed against sun-baked earth, forehead touching the ground in the ancient posture of supplication. 3 years had passed since the accident. 3 years since Martha's voice had faded to silence, since the ranch had crumbled without her laughter to hold it together. The land felt empty now, vast and unforgiving, matching the hollow ache in his chest. He'd found God in this solitude, in the endless sky, and the promise of something larger than his pain. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Samuel's prayer continued. Whispered words in Spanish and English, a mixture of inherited faith and desperate need. The wind carried his words across the wasteland, but they seemed to vanish into the vastness. He was alone here, as he'd chosen to be, as he deserved to be after failing to save what mattered most. A flash of lightning illuminated the approaching storm. Samuel raised his head, squinting at the horizon. Something moved in the distance. A carriage, pitching and swaying as it struggled against the wind. He watched as it veered toward the crossroads, as if drawn by some invisible force toward this place where 4 dusty paths converged. The carriage pitched violently, wheels catching on hidden rocks. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to his holster, then fell away. There was no threat here, only another soul battling the storm. Yet something in him resisted rising, resisted offering help. Solitude had become his armor, and stepping outside it felt like removing his skin. The carriage lurched to a stop 50 yards away, its driver struggling with panicked horses. Samuel remained kneeling, watching, torn between his need for isolation and an older, deeper call he could no longer remember. The carriage finally came to rest against the base of the Crossroads sign, its passenger door hanging open like a broken wing. Samuel rose slowly, his joints protesting, and wiped dust from his knees. A woman's voice called out, sharp with controlled panic. "It's all right, James. I'm unhurt." The voice carried a slight tremor, but dignity held it steady. "Take your time with the horses." Samuel approached cautiously, keeping his distance as the driver worked to calm the panicked animals. The woman sat in the doorway of the carriage, her dark dress immaculate despite the storm, her face turned toward the sky with something approaching gratitude. "Rain's coming," Samuel said, the first words spoken at the crossroads in days. She looked toward him, and he saw her clearly for the first time, mid-40s, with a face that had known sorrow but wore it with grace. Her eyes held the particular stillness of someone who had learned to live with absence. "Perhaps that's a blessing," she replied. "I confess I wasn't looking forward to sleeping under the stars." She gestured to the crossroads, this junction of unlikely travelers. "I didn't expect to find anyone here." "This is where paths cross," Samuel said, then immediately regretted the poetic words. He preferred facts to metaphors. "Church is 2 miles south. Town's that way." He pointed to different directions, emphasizing distances, keeping conversation practical. "Actually," she said, standing carefully and brushing dust from her skirts, "I think I'm exactly where I need to be." She looked at the crossroads sign, then back at him. "I'm Eleanor. Eleanor Hartwell." Samuel's hand moved to remove his hat, then stopped. He'd been worshiping in the presence of God when she arrived. Some protocols mattered. "Samuel Reyes. This ground is special to me. I can see that." Eleanor's gaze moved to the worn path where he'd been kneeling, the rocks positioned in a small circle. "I apologize for interrupting your prayer." You didn't, Samuel began, then stopped. She had, in fact, interrupted. But her presence didn't feel like an intrusion. It felt like something else entirely, something he couldn't name and wasn't sure he trusted. Thunder rumbled closer. The first drops of rain began to fall, large and warm, hitting the dust in perfect circles. The rain came suddenly, as desert storms do, a wall of water that drove them both to seek shelter beneath the Crossroads sign. The wooden roof barely covered them, but it was enough, a small island of dryness in the deluge. Samuel stood on one side of the signpost, Eleanor on the other, an invisible boundary marked by the cast-iron post. The space felt intimate and enormous at once, sealed away from the world by curtains of falling water. "You pray here regularly," Eleanor observed. Not a question, but an acknowledgement. Her voice was conversational, not probing. "I can see where you've worn the ground smooth." 3 years, Samuel said, surprised by his own honesty. He never spoke about this place, about the ritual that had become his anchor. "Since my wife died. I'm sorry." The words were simple, without pretense or the need to fill silence. "My husband, too, a year ago this past spring." The rain intensified, hammering the roof above their heads. Samuel found himself studying Eleanor's profile. The line of her jaw, the way her hands rested at her sides, relaxed despite their shared situation. She seemed at home in the storm, not fighting it or wishing it away. "We both know loss," he said, the admission feeling both dangerous and inevitable. "And we both know this crossroads," Eleanor replied. "Maybe that's why the storm brought us here. Some places are meant for travelers who need to stop, not just pass through." Samuel shifted, uncomfortable with the notion of destiny. He preferred to believe in coincidence, in the mechanical causes and effects that kept the world predictable. Yet something about Eleanor's presence felt orchestrated, as if someone had been pulling strings he couldn't see. "Where are you traveling to?" he asked. "Colorado, my sister's place. I thought a fresh start might help." She didn't elaborate on what needed freshening. Grief didn't require explanations between people who understood it. The rain began to ease, but neither moved to leave their shelter. They stood in the dry space between the storm and the dusty paths. Two people who had been traveling toward different destinations but found themselves at the same crossroads, needing the same thing: time to breathe. As the storm passed, sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the wet earth in shades of gold and copper. Samuel stepped out from under the sign, breathing deeply of the ozone-scented air. The crossroads looked different now, washed clean and gleaming. Eleanor emerged beside him, her gaze taking in the transformed landscape. She moved with careful grace, avoiding the puddles that had formed in the low spots. Samuel watched her navigate the muddy ground, noting how she preserved her dignity even in this moment of disarray. The horses, now calm, cropped at the fresh grass that had sprouted in the sudden rain. The driver, James, Eleanor had called him, checked the carriage wheels with practiced efficiency. They'd be ready to leave soon, Samuel realized. The interruption was ending, and they'd all return to their separate journeys. But something held them here, a weight that made departure feel premature. "I should check on the animals," James said, moving toward the horses. It was a polite excuse to give them privacy, Samuel understood. Some conversations required witnesses, others required witnesses to be elsewhere. Eleanor waited until James was out of earshot, then turned to Samuel. "Would you mind if would it be appropriate for me to—" She gestured vaguely toward his prayer circle, where the wet ground had revealed more than the storm had erased. Samuel followed her gaze and saw them. Small stones arranged in the exact pattern where Martha had taught him to kneel, each placed by his own hands, worn smooth by 3 years of devotion. They formed a rough square, marking a sacred space that felt suddenly exposed. "It's holy ground," he said, though he wasn't sure who he was protecting, himself or the place. "I know." Eleanor's voice was gentle, understanding. "Forgive me for asking, but may I have something that needs blessing, too." Samuel studied her face, seeing in it his own need reflected. What she carried was heavier than grief, deeper than mere loss. Whatever her burden, she'd come to the crossroads hoping for the same thing he had: peace. Without a word, he stepped aside, creating space for her in the circle that had been his alone. Eleanor's face brightened with gratitude, and she reached into her small travel bag. Her hands, when they emerged, held something that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. A hat. Small, child size, worn soft by small hands. Black felt, fashioned in the style of every working man's hat. But sized for someone who would never grow into it fully. Eleanor knelt in the mud beside Samuel's worn stones, and for the first time in 3 years, the crossroads contained 2 sets of prayers. 2 days later, Samuel found Eleanor's carriage still at the crossroads. He approached carefully, noting the careful arrangement of the camp James had made. The horses grazed nearby. The carriage had been positioned to provide shelter, and a small fire ring suggested this was becoming more than a stopover. "You're staying," Samuel said when Eleanor emerged from the carriage's shadow. "We are." Her voice carried no apology, only simple statement of fact. "This place, it feels like home, or at least like the place where home could start again." Samuel felt the familiar stir of his territorial instinct. This crossroads had been his sanctuary, his private church, his conversation with God. The arrival of Eleanor and James had changed that, bringing human complexity into his carefully ordered spiritual life. "I come here to be alone," he said, harsher than he'd intended. "And I come here to be less alone," Eleanor replied. "There's room for both of us, Samuel. The crossroads was here long before either of us found it." James emerged from his work with the horses, his expression diplomatically blank. He understood he was witnessing something important, and he positioned himself where he could provide privacy without appearing to eavesdrop. "You don't understand," Samuel said, his voice tightening. "This place, it's where I come to remember, to ask for forgiveness, to—" He struggled to explain the relationship between himself and this dusty patch of earth. How could he describe the way this place held Martha's memory, how every stone marked a moment when he felt closer to understanding his loss? "Then help me understand." Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that he could see the depth of her own need reflected in her eyes. "Because I think we're both carrying burdens that were too heavy to carry alone. Maybe this crossroads was meant for 2 people who need to set down their loads." Samuel felt the ground shifting beneath him, not just the literal earth, but the careful architecture of his grief. For 3 years, he'd built his identity around solitude, around the idea that what happened here was his alone. The arrival of Eleanor was challenging that foundation in ways that felt both threatening and necessary. "James," Eleanor said without turning around, "perhaps you could check the horses again. Take your time." The driver moved away, giving them true privacy. Eleanor and Samuel stood alone at the crossroads, surrounded by the evidence of shared space. 2 prayer circles now worn into the earth, 2 sets of gear arranged in careful symmetry, 2 lives that had intersected and were changing each other irrevocably. "I won't ask you to leave," Samuel said finally, "but I need you to understand that what happens here is sacred. This ground holds more than just our presence." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I understand." And perhaps that's exactly why I'm meant to be here. To remember what I brought to this place, to honor what we're both carrying, without taking anything away from your memories or your mourning. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades that reminded Samuel of Martha's hair. He looked at Eleanor, saw the way the light caught in her eyes, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not attraction, not romance, but recognition. The sense of two people who had found themselves in the same impossible situation and were learning to navigate it together. On the fourth morning, Samuel found Eleanor sitting in her prayer circle before dawn, her posture mirroring his own dedication. She had taken to the ritual with the quiet intensity of someone who understood its importance. The child's hat sat before her, as carefully positioned as the stones that marked her space. Samuel knelt in his own circle, but found his attention drifting. There was something different about Eleanor this morning, a stillness that went deeper than her usual quiet grace. When she finally raised her head, her eyes were red-rimmed but determined. "I'm ready," she said simply. "Ready for what?" "To tell you about Thomas." She held up the child's hat, turning it slowly in her hands. "My son's name was Thomas. He would have been 15 this year. Instead of getting to know who he might have become, I know exactly how he died." Samuel's hands stilled in his prayer position. This was the first time she had spoken of her son, and he could hear the careful control in her voice, the way grief had been shaped into narrative through repeated telling. "He was helping with harvest," Eleanor continued. "There was an accident with the wagon, and the horses spooked. Thomas, he stayed with the animals when he could have saved himself. He died trying to keep them from trampling the younger children." The story unfolded with surgical precision. Eleanor had practiced this telling, had polished the edges until it could be spoken without breaking. But Samuel could hear the raw pain underneath, the way love had been compressed into something manageable, but never truly healed. "I came to this crossroads running from my anger," Eleanor said. "I was angry at God, at the world, at myself for not being there, for not being able to protect him, for having to bury my child while other mothers got to watch theirs grow up." Samuel rose from his kneeling position, dust falling from his clothes. "I was angry too at first, at God, at the world, at Martha for dying, at myself for surviving." He moved closer to Eleanor, close enough to see the fine tremor in her hands. "I spent 2 years being angry at the universe for being unfair. And then I realized that the universe was never going to be fair, that the only choice was whether to rage against that truth or find peace within it." Samuel sat down on the ground beside Eleanor's circle, crossing his legs. "I came here to ask God why, to demand explanations. But mostly, I came here to sit with the weight of loss until it became bearable." Eleanor's smile was tremulous but genuine. "I think I understand now. This isn't about getting answers. It's about learning to carry the questions." "Exactly." Samuel looked at the 2 prayer circles, at the way they'd been worn into the earth through repetition and need. Some places are meant for people who need to sit with their grief until it transforms into something else. What does it transform into? Samuel was quiet for a long moment, watching the sunrise paint the desert in shades of hope he wasn't sure he believed in, but had learned to appreciate. "I think it transforms into love. Not less love for the person we lost, but more capacity to love the people still here." Eleanor reached out, her hand hovering just short of touching his arm. "May I?" Samuel nodded, and her fingers found his forearm in a gesture of shared understanding. For the first time since Martha's death, Samuel felt his grief not as an isolating weight, but as a bridge to someone else who understood the landscape of loss. By the second week, a pattern had emerged. Samuel would arrive at the crossroads as dawn lightened the eastern sky, finding Eleanor already in her prayer circle. They'd kneel in parallel silence, two figures bent in supplication, while the desert awakened around them. No words were necessary. The child's hat sat in its place of honor, just as Samuel's wedding ring had been placed on a stone beside his prayer circle. The ring had been Martha's grandmother's, 4 generations of love, and Samuel wore it on a chain around his neck. But here, in the space between the circles, he had placed a small stone to mark its absence. Eleanor had noticed the stone immediately. On the 3rd day, she had placed a small wildflower beside it. On the 4th day, another flower. By the end of the week, a small garden of desert blooms marked the space where love had been transformed into memory. James had proven to be an unobtrusive presence, tending the horses and maintaining the camp with the efficiency of someone who understood that his employer needed this place and this ritual. He and Samuel had developed a working relationship based on shared responsibility for the practical details of their shared temporary home. The silence between Samuel and Eleanor was comfortable, not empty. They moved around each other with the growing ease of people who were learning to share sacred space. When Eleanor's supplies ran low, Samuel returned from town with enough to share. When Samuel's boots needed mending, James performed the task with grateful acknowledgement of Eleanor's hospitality. On the 10th morning, Eleanor broke their silent routine. She rose from her prayer circle and walked to the space between them, kneeling down and carefully arranging the small stones that marked their shared boundary. As she worked, she began to hum, a melody Samuel recognized but couldn't name, something that might have been a lullaby or a hymn, or perhaps both. Samuel finished his prayers and watched her work. The way she placed each stone was deliberate, purposeful, as if she were constructing something more than a simple arrangement. When she finished, she sat back on her heels and looked at him. "This space," she said, "it's not a boundary anymore, it's a connection." Samuel studied the pattern she had created. The stones formed a gentle curve, bridging the gap between their 2 circles. It was a simple thing, but it transformed the entire geometry of their shared space. Where there had been 2 separate sacred areas, there was now one continuous place of prayer. "Will you pray with me?" Eleanor asked. Samuel felt the familiar stir of his protective instincts, the part of him that preferred to keep his worship private. But looking at the arrangement Eleanor had made, seeing the way she had physically connected their sacred spaces, he found himself nodding. They knelt together in the space between their circles, Eleanor's hat on one side, Samuel's ringstone on the other, the desert stretching endlessly around them. Samuel began to speak, not Martha's name, but a simple prayer of gratitude for the unexpected grace of shared understanding. When they finished, Eleanor reached for his hand, and Samuel allowed the touch. Her fingers were warm and gentle, and for the first time in 3 years, Samuel felt his grief not as an isolating weight, but as something that had been transformed through connection. The arrival of the town preacher and 3 other men on horseback changed everything. Samuel recognized them immediately, Reverend Morrison, along with the sheriff and 2 of the local ranchers. They approached the Crossroads with the careful formality of people who had come to address a situation that required witness and resolution. Samuel rose from his prayer circle, Eleanor beside him, James stepping forward from his work with the horses. The group dismounted with deliberate slowness, their movements suggesting they had rehearsed this encounter. "Reyes," the sheriff tipped his hat. "Reverend Morrison wanted to check on you. Word's been going around town that that you've got company at your regular prayer spot." Eleanor stepped forward, and Samuel felt the familiar urge to protect her privacy. But when she placed her hand lightly on his arm, he understood that she was ready to face whatever judgment might be coming. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell," she said simply. This is my driver, James. We've been staying at the Crossroads while we determine our next steps." Reverend Morrison studied them both with the careful expression of a man whose job required him to assess the spiritual health of his community. Samuel could see the preacher cataloging details: Eleanor's obvious grief, the way they had established camp, the careful respect of the shared prayer circles. "Ma'am," Morrison said, removing his hat, "I don't mean any disrespect, but this is unusual. Samuel's been coming to this Crossroads for years, and it's always been understood that this was his private place of worship." Eleanor's grip tightened on Samuel's arm, but her voice remained steady. "Reverend Morrison, I understand your concern, but I think Samuel can speak for himself about whether my presence has been welcome here." All eyes turned to Samuel. He felt the weight of their expectation, the way this moment would define what followed. He could have given the expected answer, explained that Eleanor was only passing through, that the Crossroads would return to its solitary state. But looking at the arrangement Eleanor had made, at the stones that connected their circles, at the way their shared space had become something larger than either had managed alone. "She's right," Samuel said. "I can speak for myself." He paused, gathering words that felt both important and inadequate. 3 years ago, this place was about my loss. Eleanor's presence here hasn't taken anything away from that. It's added something to it, the ability to share grief without diluting it, the recognition that sacred space can hold more than one person's pain. The sheriff's expression remained neutral, but Reverend Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. This was not the answer any of them had expected. 3 years ago, Samuel continued, I came here to ask God why I had to lose everything. Eleanor's taught me something I couldn't learn alone, that sometimes what we lose is meant to create space for what we need next. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. The men exchanged glances, uncertainty replacing the certainty of their initial approach. "What exactly are you saying, Samuel?" Reverend Morrison asked. Samuel looked at Eleanor, at James, at the crossroads that had become their shared sanctuary. "I'm saying that this place has been blessed by her presence, that sometimes God sends us exactly who we need, exactly when we need them, even when that person looks nothing like what we expected grace to look like." The silence stretched between them, filled with the understanding that something fundamental had just changed. Eleanor Hartwell, a widow traveling west with her driver, had been formally recognized as part of the sacred geography of the Crossroads. The recognition felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. 2 weeks after the preacher's visit, Eleanor made an announcement that changed everything. She and James would be staying at the Crossroads permanently. The decision was presented not as a request for permission, but as a simple statement of fact that required no one's approval but her own. Samuel felt a mixture of emotions, not all of them comfortable. 3 years of solitude had given him certain expectations about space and privacy, about the way his days would unfold. Eleanor's decision to stay was both welcome and unsettling. The practical arrangements were handled efficiently. James began constructing a small cabin at the northern edge of the Crossroads, using materials Eleanor had ordered from town. Eleanor insisted on contributing to the work, her hands learning skills she'd never needed as a rancher's wife. Samuel found himself drawn into the project, offering guidance on building techniques and sharing his knowledge of desert survival. The work brought them closer together in ways that prayer alone had not. They learned each other's habits, preferences, and rhythms. Eleanor discovered that Samuel rose before dawn and preferred to pray before speaking to anyone. Samuel learned that Eleanor needed time alone in the evenings, sitting by their shared fire and writing in a small journal. But it was Eleanor's gesture that cemented their new reality in a way that made the transition irreversible. On a Thursday morning, as they knelt in their connected prayer circles, Eleanor reached into her bag and withdrew a small bundle of cloth. When she unfolded it, Samuel saw the child's hat inside, a different one, smaller and more carefully preserved than the one she used in her prayers. "Thomas had this hat for his 9th birthday," Eleanor said softly. "It's the last thing he wore before—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Samuel understood. Eleanor placed the hat beside the prayer circle she had been using. "I want you to have this, Samuel, not as a replacement for what you've lost, but as a symbol of what we've both found here." Samuel stared at the hat, understanding the magnitude of the gesture. Eleanor was giving him something that connected her to her son's memory, trusting him to honor both the gift and its significance. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that this is what I brought here today, my son's memory and my trust in you to help me carry both." Eleanor's voice was steady, but Samuel could see the courage it took to make this offering. Later that day, as they worked on the cabin, James mentioned casually that Eleanor had been worried about her decision to stay. "She wasn't sure how you'd react to her settling here permanently," he said. "She thought maybe you'd see it as her claiming your space." Samuel paused in his work, considering this information. Eleanor had been afraid of intruding, afraid that her need for home would overwhelm his need for solitude. But instead of asking for reassurance or trying to negotiate boundaries, she had simply claimed her place and then demonstrated her commitment through generous gestures, like the hat. That evening, as they sat around their fire, Samuel made his own gesture of acceptance. He removed the chain from around his neck and set Martha's ring carefully on the stone that marked her absence. "This place holds all of our losses now," he said. "All of our remembrances. It's not just my sanctuary anymore. It's ours." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was brilliant. "I was hoping you'd say that." The ring and the hat sat beside each other in the space between their circles, a permanent reminder that their shared space honored the past even as it embraced whatever future might unfold here at the Crossroads. 6 months later, the Crossroads had become something neither Samuel nor Eleanor had expected. A small community built around shared grief, transformed into shared purpose. The cabin had grown into 2 structures, with a small workshop where James had begun making furniture for sale in town. Eleanor maintained a garden that bloomed unexpectedly in the desert climate, providing vegetables and flowers that seemed to nourish more than the body. Samuel still came to the Crossroads each morning to pray, but the ritual had evolved. The prayer circles had expanded, with stones marking not just his and Eleanor's spaces, but additional areas where other travelers occasionally joined them. The space had been consecrated not by any official ceremony, but by the simple fact that people in need had found comfort there. The morning of the anniversary of Eleanor's arrival, Samuel found her sitting in her prayer circle before dawn. But she wasn't praying. She was simply sitting, the child's hat held gently in her hands, her face turned toward the eastern sky with an expression of profound peace. "You look different today," Samuel observed, settling into his own circle beside her. "I am different." Eleanor's voice carried a weight of certainty that had been building over the months. "I spent 2 years after Thomas died, believing that my life was over, that being his mother was my only identity, and that without him, I had no reason to continue being anyone at all." Samuel nodded, recognizing the landscape of grief she described. He had lived there himself, in the space where love had been compressed into absence. "But coming here, being with you, learning to carry Thomas's memory as something that connects me to the world instead of isolating me from it, that's changed everything." Eleanor placed the hat carefully in its spot. "I can be Thomas's mother, and Eleanor Hartwell, and Samuel's friend all at the same time. None of those identities has to erase the others." "Exactly." Samuel felt the rightness of her words settling into the space between them. Martha isn't gone just because I can feel joy now. Thomas isn't forgotten just because you can find peace. Love doesn't diminish when it becomes bearable. It just changes form. Reverend Morrison appeared on the horizon, riding alone. He had become a regular visitor over the months, sometimes joining their morning prayers, sometimes simply sharing coffee and conversation. Samuel had grown to appreciate the preacher's quiet acceptance of whatever this place had become. "Morning, Samuel. Eleanor." Morrison dismounted and approached their circles with the reverence of someone who understood that this ground held more than human purposes. "I wanted to check on you both before town meeting today." "Everything's well," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the contentment of someone who had found her rightful place in the world. The three of them sat together as the sun climbed higher, watching the desert come alive with the new day. The Crossroads was busy now, with travelers stopping to pray or rest, or simply sit in the presence of something sacred. But the morning stillness remained, preserved by the understanding that this place held space for both activity and contemplation. "Will you be staying for the full day?" Samuel asked Morrison. "Actually, I had an idea I wanted to run by you both." The preacher looked slightly embarrassed by his own suggestion. "The town council is talking about building a proper roadhouse here, a place where travelers can find lodging and meals. Nothing fancy, but clean and welcoming." Eleanor and Samuel exchanged glances, understanding immediately what this would mean. The Crossroads would remain, but it would no longer be their private sanctuary. It would become part of the larger world in ways that might change its essential character. "I know it would mean more people, more noise, less privacy," Morrison continued, "but it would also mean this place could be a source of income for you both, and a center of hospitality for travelers who need what you found here." Eleanor stood and walked to the space between their circles, where the stones marked the boundary that had become a connection. "Samuel?" He joined her, and together they looked at the arrangement they had created. Two prayer circles connected by a bridge of carefully placed stones, surrounded by the evidence of a life built around hospitality and shared purpose. "I think," Samuel said slowly, "that this place was always meant to welcome strangers. Eleanor and I just got here first." He smiled at her. "Maybe it was always going to become something larger than either of us imagined." Eleanor reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining in the gesture that had become natural over the months. "Thomas taught me that some forms of love require sacrifice. Martha taught you the same thing. Maybe this is just another way that lesson plays out." The three of them stood together in the morning light, looking at the crossroads that had become their shared home. The roadhouse would be built, the sanctuary would change. But the essential spirit of the place, the recognition that this was where people came when they needed to set down their burdens and pick up new purpose, that would remain. The cowboy who had prayed alone at the crossroads had found what he didn't know he was looking for. Not just peace, but the ability to create space for others to find their own peace. And the widow who had arrived running from her grief had discovered that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to carry love in ways that could be shared. The Crossroads held their stories now, but it was ready to hold others' stories as well. In the end, that had always been its purpose. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you'd been riding that lonely road, would you have stopped when you saw him praying? Tell us in the comments.